In this lesson, we're going to look at working with props and adding layer swapping to your rig. We'll talk a little bit later about what we mean by layer swapping. But all of these techniques are based around controlling the opacity of layers with a checkbox control, which is useful for all kinds of situations in character rigging. Let's start by taking a quick look at working with props. Now, we already looked at one way of dealing with props when we looked at creating a replacement rig for a hand. And if you recall, we had one hand that was holding a beer bottle, and we merely selected that hand when we wanted the character holding the beer bottle. And that's certainly one way to handle that. But this could get unwieldy if you were working with larger props where you'd have to make the hand pre-comp super large to encompass large props. And putting props in a hand selector also wouldn't work if you weren't going to have a replacement hand rig, if you had a mechanical rig for your hand, but you still wanted your character to work with props. So in this lesson, we'll learn about working with props that are not embedded within a hand selector. So you can either work with larger props or with a mechanically rigged hand. So let's begin by looking at adding just a single prop to our character's rig here. So we're going to start in Hipster Man Rig 1. Let's go ahead and unshy our layers. And let's turn on the visibility of the G skateboard comp here. And you can see we have a little skateboard here that pops up. And the first thing we want to do is get this prop placed both in our layer stack and with our hand. Now in this particular case, we are using a replacement rig. What we've done is created a hand pose that'll allow the character to hold the skateboard. So I'm going to move the skateboard down underneath the left hand comp here. So it's sitting back behind the hand. And then I'm going to go to the left hand controller, and we're going to go all the way to the end of the hand selector here. And you can see that we've got a hand with the thumb masked off so that the thumb can kind of appear to be wrapped behind the skateboard. Now, creating a hand pose that can hold a prop can potentially get complicated, especially if the hand has to be sort of interlaced with the prop in some way. In those cases, you might want to consider having the prop within the hand selector. If you're working with a mechanical rig, you can often just pose the hand in such a way that it will sit on the prop appropriately. You may have to work a little bit with the layering of the fingers and the hand pieces so that they appear to wrap around the prop appropriately. This is one of those areas where having a good idea of what your character is going to have to do before you get into the rigging process will allow you to plan ahead for some of these things, so you don't run into any uncomfortable surprises once you get farther into the rigging. But in our case here, just having a hand pose with the thumb masked off will work just fine for our situation here. And so now we just need to position the skateboard so it sits behind that hand in a comfortable way. I'm going to go ahead and turn adaptive resolution on here so we can make sure and get this placed carefully. And I'm going to kind of just click this up so it's sitting right where that cutoff is. And we may want to move this in X a little bit so he's holding it maybe a little more in the center. Once we've got the prop in place, attaching it to the rig is, of course, a very simple matter of just parenting this to the hand structure. So wherever the hand goes, the prop will go. No big surprises there. Let's also color code this skateboard red because it's part of the left arm rigging here. And now, of course, when we grab the hand controller and move it, the prop moves with it. Now, if your character is holding a prop throughout the entire animation, then at this point you're done. But in so many cases, characters need to pick a prop up or set a prop down or both. And in those cases, you need to have the ability to turn a prop on and turn a prop off. It's usually easiest to have an instance of the prop in the position it needs to be in within the scene comp, and then when the character goes to pick it up, to pop the prop on into the character's hand as soon as they grab it. So being able to turn the visibility of your prop on and off is very often the kind of control you will need. Now Duik also has a parent link constraint, so you can actually animate the parenting of a layer. Now in some cases, this might be an option that you would want to use instead of just having the ability to turn the prop on and off. But that usually requires that the prop exist within the rig comp. And that's not always going to work. Say if you have a character walking into a scene and picking up a prop, you don't want that prop in the character's rig comp because you're going to create a in-place walk cycle and then drag the rig comp across the scene. So in those cases, a parent link isn't really going to do the job. And again, what we need is just the ability to turn the prop on and off. So the character can either pick up the prop from a scene or drop the prop within the scene. And luckily, thanks to our awesome connector tool, this is an easy thing to rig up. So the first thing we need to do is create a simple animation on our prop layer to turn the opacity of the prop on and off. So with the layer selected, we'll hit the T key for opacity. And let's create a keyframe at frame 0 with the opacity at 0. And then let's go ahead just 10 frames or really however many frames you want. And let's then turn the opacity back to 100, make a second keyframe right there. So we just have two simple keyframes, opacity off and opacity on. Now we're going to go to the left-hand controller and we're going to add a checkbox. So let's right-click in the Effect Control window, go down to Expression Controls, and add a checkbox control. And we'll call that control Prop On Off, or whatever you'd like to name it. I'm going to move that up above the IK reverse and right underneath the hand slider. And then we're going to go to our left-hand controller layer, hit the E key, and tab open the Prop On and Off checkbox and select the word checkbox. Then we're going to go into our connector and choose that checkbox as our master property. Now when we're setting our values here, we only have two options, 0 and 1. A checkbox is either on or it's off. 0 is off, 1 is on. So our minimum will be 0 and our maximum will be 1. And that will coincide with our opacity keyframe being off at 0% and our opacity keyframe being on at 100%. Then we just need to select those opacity keyframes and connect to properties. Now when we go to our left hand here, you'll notice our skateboard popped off because our checkbox defaults to off. When we check it on, our skateboard comes on. When we check it off, our skateboard goes off. Now we'd of course want to animate this in conjunction with our slider so that our thumb reappears here. So we would animate our hand going to hand 40 and then animate our checkbox on for him to hold the skateboard. Really nice, easy control to rig thanks to the connector, and a great way to manage just a single prop. But what happens if our character is going to need to handle multiple props? Well, in that case, we can create exactly the same rig setup with the prop on and off switch, but just combine that with a replacement rig. So we're not going to go through this because we've done replacement rigs before, and we just did the prop on and off checkbox. Let's just take a look at a combination of those two things. So let's go to Hipsterman Rig 2, and you'll see here if we select on the left hand, we have the prop on and off checkbox, but we also have a prop selector, and we have the skateboard at 0, we have a guitar at 10, and we have the beer bottle at 20. So there's absolutely no surprises here. If we tab open our layers here, you can see that we have our props still parented to our hand structure, and they have the same opacity animation tied to that checkbox that we just looked at. The only difference is that the props are pre-comp, and within that pre-comp we have a replacement rig tied to that slider. So again, no surprises here at all stuff we have done before. The one thing that you need to sort of plan out is to make sure that your props within your prop selector pre-comp are aligned the same way, so they sit within the hand you've created to hold them, or you have to create multiple hands, one for each prop. So a hand to hold one prop, a hand to hold the other prop. In this case, our single hand here with the cut off thumb works for all three of our props because we simply align them all to sit right there next to that cut out thumb. So this is a really nice rig setup for a character that needs to deal with multiple props. Now this same opacity checkbox control that we've looked at here for the props can also be used to create a layer swap. And what I mean by a layer swap is the ability to jump a character's layer from one level in the layer stack to another. Now this is particularly useful for 2D characters who don't have the advantage of actually moving in three-dimensional space. And one of the main areas where this is very useful is with the arms. So let's take a look at an example of this. So let's look at Hipster Man Rig 3 here. And we've got the arms just rigged up normally here. But there's a limitation to this rig, which is I can move the left hand over the front of the body. But what if I wanted to move this arm behind the body because, say, he's hiding something behind his back? Or I wanted to put both arms behind the body in sort of a contemplative pose or something like that. And of course, I can move the right hand behind the body. But what if I wanted the right hand to be in front of the body, so he's holding his stomach like he has a stomach ache or he's hungry or something? Or again, what if I want both arms behind the body? Either way, I don't get this option without layer swapping. So let's look at setting up a layer swapping rig so that these arms can move in front of and behind those body parts. Now, in order to show you kind of two different versions of this, I've got these two arms rigged just slightly differently, which of course I don't recommend you do in a real rig, but we've just done that here just so we can demonstrate a couple variations on this basic technique. So let's start with the right hand here. Let's unshy our layers, and let's go down to the right hand body pieces. And you can see that in this case, we have a simple jointed rig, no puppet tools at all. Now, in most cases, when you're doing a layer swap on an arm, you're only going to want to do that with the lower arm and the hand, and you're going to want to leave the upper arm on the layer it's at. Notice the upper arm here is sitting behind the torso, which suggests the three-quarter pose here. This arm is sitting in front of the torso. That gives us that three-quarter sense. In this case, it makes more sense to leave those as they are and just layer swap the lower arm and the hand. Now, this is going to completely depend on your individual character's design, but with this character design and in many of the character designs you're going to run into, this will be the case. So let's create a layer swap so that this right lower arm and hand can switch from being behind the body to being in front of the body. So what we're going to do is unlock the hand and the lower arm layers. We're going to select both of those layers and we're going to duplicate them. With those layers duplicated, we're going to click and drag those layers up above the torso, the head, and the left leg. We can leave it behind the left arm, although we could put it above that if it was necessary, but we're going to put it below the left arm, so there's still a sense of that three-quarter view with the left arm being in front. Let's rename these layers. By just adding top to the ends of their titles, just to help keep track of these duplicated layers. Now note that they're still functioning perfectly with our rig, because our rigging is really on the structure layers, and these layers are simply parented to those structure layers. So we don't have to do any re-rigging or anything. We can just duplicate them, move them, rename them, and now when we move the controller it's moving both sets of lower arm and hand layers. Now, just like we did with our props, we now need to create some animation on these layers that we can control with a checkbox. Now, there's a couple different ways you can set this up, but the way I like to do it is so that when the checkbox is off, the arm, whatever arm it is, right or left in a 3/4 character, they're going to be different. The arm is in its normal position in the layer stack. And when the checkbox is on, the arm is either moved forward or backward in the layer stack to create our layer swap. I tend to think that's the most intuitive approach. Now, you could potentially also set this up so that checkbox on, arm is forward, checkbox off, arm is back, regardless of whether it's the right or left arm in a 3/4 pose. But I honestly think that's a little overwrought. But of course, you can set up your rig the way you like. But let's go ahead and set this one up as I described. So when the checkbox is off, everything is kind of in its normal state. When the checkbox is on, the layers swap. So what that means is our top level layers here are going to start at frame 0 with their opacities at 0. So we're going to make keyframes there at 0. And on our original lower arm and hand, we're going to make keyframes at 100% at frame 0. So in other words, at frame 0, everything is normal. The layers are as they were when we initially rigged the character. Then we're going to jump ahead 10 frames or however many frames you want. I'm just going to do 10. And at 10 frames, I want the original lower arm and hand to turn off. And I want our top level lower arm and hand to turn on. Now, I technically don't have to turn off the bottom layers, but it should improve the performance of the rig just a little bit if you turn off the layers that you don't actually need. So now that we've got our animation on our 4 layers here, now we just need to go to the right hand controller. We've got a little bit of a mess here. Let's kind of clean this up a little bit. This controller and arm layer should really be down here. And let's go ahead and add that checkbox control. And we'll call that right arm front back, or whatever you want to call it. You could call it layer swap or whatever. And I'm going to move that up above here, put it under the hand selector. And then with that layer selected, we'll hit the E key, tab open that checkbox control and select it. We will choose that as our master property. Make sure you see the minimum and maximum change to make sure that you've got that new checkbox selected. Then we'll once again have the minimum of 0 and the maximum of 1. And now we're going to select all of these keyframes, the 4 there and the 4 here, and connect to properties. Now we have this nice handy control where when we check it on, the arm comes forward. When we check it off, the arm goes back to its regular layer stack. And all of this works with the rigging that we've had all along. We didn't have to do any re-rigging of anything. Just works right with that same rig, and the same controller controls all those layers. Really, really nice. Okay, let's close these layers up and lock them back up. Now, if you decide you prefer the idea of checkbox on, arm in front, checkbox off, arm in back, if that feels more intuitive to you, simply come down to the checkbox connector effect here and just reverse the minimum and maximum, and then you'll have that exact setup. Again, I find this a little more intuitive, off normal, checkbox on, layer swapped, but you can set it up however you like. The connector tool makes it really, really easy to make that change. And it's also something, if you're passing your rig off to another animator, that you could discuss with the animator and say, hey, I set this up this way. Does that make sense to you, or would you prefer it set a different way? In that case, you could make the change very easily with the checkbox connector effect. Okay, let's put this hand back in its neutral position here. And let's take a look at adding a layer swap to our left hand. Now, this procedure is really going to be basically exactly the same, but there's just one little difference that we want to look at here. And it's really hardly a difference, but something I want to make you aware of. This left arm is actually rigged with a blended joint. In other words, instead of just a plain joint with the upper and lower arm parented directly to the structure, we actually have puppet tools with bones on these layers so that we can have the stretchy IK along with the jointed rig. That's, of course, the advantage of the blended joint. Now, the super duper cool thing about the way Duik works with the whole bone script is that even though we have puppet tools and bones on these layers, we still don't have to do any re-rigging in order to make this layer swap work. So let's take a look at how this works. So just like we did before, we're going to unlock the hand and the lower arm. Just like we did before, we're going to select those two layers and we're going to duplicate them. Just like we did before, but in reverse, we're now going to move those layers down in our layer stack to be below the head, the torso, and the legs, but above the right arm. And we're going to add bottom to the names of these layers. Now you can name these however you like, but I recommend naming them in some way to differentiate them from the layers that we duplicated them from. And before we go ahead and add our opacity animations, I just want to note that all of our rigging is still working with those duplicate layers, even though we're using the puppet tool on this lower arm. Because here's the cool thing. This lower arm is a duplicate of our initial lower arm, so we duplicated the puppet tool, and we duplicated the expression code that is attached to each of these puppet pins, tying them to the Duik bones. In other words, they're still tied to the same bones. So we don't have to re-rig anything at all. They're still connected to those same bones, which are still connected to the same structures, and so the rig works perfectly normally. So part of what I wanted to show you here is that if you're using a regular jointed rig, or if you're using a blended joint rig with the puppet tools on each layer, the procedure is literally exactly the same, and in neither case does any re-rigging need to be done, which is super cool. So let's go ahead and finish this up quickly. So our duplicated hand and lower arm at frame 0, we want those to be set at 0 opacity. Because again, frame 0, things will be normal. At frame 10, they'll be with the layers swapped. Likewise, with our original layers, here at frame 0, we want their opacity at 100. Then at frame 10, the opacity of our original layers here will go down to 0, and the opacity of our new layers on the bottom will go to 100, thus putting the lower arm and the hand behind the body. Just like we did before, we're going to select the left hand controller, and we're going to add that checkbox control. Call that left arm front back. Move that up. And we will select our layer. Tab open that checkbox and select it. Choose that as our master property. And we want to make sure that our minimum and maximum returns to 0 and 100 to make sure that we have selected our new checkbox rather than the previous checkbox we had selected here for our master. Then we want to change our minimum and maximum from 0 to 100 to 0 to 1. Then we need to select all 8 of our keyframes and connect to properties. Let's go ahead and clean up here. And once again, we have our arm in front in its normal state. When we check our checkbox on, our arm goes behind. And just as before, our rigging all works perfectly as it did, all controlled by the same controller. Super, super cool. All right, now there's one issue that I want to address here. When you're using this technique where you're layer swapping the lower arm and the hand only, and you've got an arm like we do here with a complicated texture, we do get this kind of radical pop in the elbow. So again, as I check the checkbox on and off, that changes pretty drastically as this lower arm comes forward and back on that upper arm. Now, you'd most likely be able to hide that with animation. So as the arm was moving, during one of those quicker movements, you could pop that layer swap during the movement, and most likely your audience wouldn't notice that. So it's definitely something that's workable, something that's hideable. It's also something that if you didn't have such a fancy texture, if you had a simpler texture or even just solid color, you wouldn't notice at all. But it's something to be aware of. If you have a complicated texture and you want to do this layer swapping, that may be a reason to not choose a jointed rig or a blended joint rig, and instead choose a puppet tooled rig where you can essentially eliminate this little elbow pop problem. I wouldn't necessarily let that be the only reason why I chose to do a puppet tooled upper and lower arm, because there are significant drawbacks with the puppet tooling. You get less of a range of motion, you get that pinching in the elbow, things that we've discussed before. Remember that what I'm trying to show you in this rigging course are a lot of different options, and I'm trying to show you the pros and cons of all these different options. And these are just some of the pros and cons you need to think about. As always, it really depends on your character's artwork, what the character needs to do, and in some cases you have to sort of prioritize. Is it more important that the character look a certain way? Is it more important that the character be able to put the arms in front of and behind the body? Is it more important that the character have a wide range of motion? You have to kind of weigh all of those priorities and make the best choices for your particular situation. It's never really going to be a right or wrong. It's just a question of pros and cons, as we've said many times. But let's take a look at what it would take to rig this same layer swap with a puppet tooled arm. And we're going to look at a few different examples of this. The procedures are a little bit different, except for the part about adding the opacity keyframes and the checkbox control. That's always the same, basically. So we're not necessarily going to repeat that. But we are going to look at the different techniques you'll need for dealing with the arm layers with puppet tooled arms. And there things get a little bit different. There's going to be a difference between a puppet tooled arm that is not pre-composed. In other words, it's just a single layer that's never been divided and has not been pre-composed, and an arm that was previously divided into an upper and lower arm and then has been pre-composed together. So there's some differences between those two situations that you might run into. And then on top of that, there's a difference in how you would set up an arm coming back to front versus an arm going from front to back. So we'll take a look at some of these differences, but in order to save time, we're not going to fully rig any of these different situations. We're just going to look at kind of the differences in dealing with the arm layers. But don't worry, our PDF cheat sheet will have full step-by-step instructions for creating layer swaps with all of these different arm situations. So even though we won't be going through every single step for every single option in this lesson, you'll be able to find that in the cheat sheet. The first situation we're going to look at is in this Orange Woman Rig 1. So let's jump over to that. Now in this situation, we're going to create a layer swap with her right arm. And you'll notice I've actually tinted her right arm and her right leg a little darker so that they look significantly different than her body, so we can see this effect a little more clearly. In this first example, we're looking at an arm that was never separated. So it wasn't ever separated at the elbow and then pre-composed into a single layer. This character always had a single layer for the arms and the legs, with the puppet tools just attached directly to that layer. So let's go ahead and unshy our layers and scroll down. And you'll see, just as I said, that we don't have a pre-comped upper and lower arm, we simply have a single layer, not pre-comped, that is our arm layer. And if I just solo that, you can see that there. And of course, that's got puppet pins on it, which are attached to our shoulder, elbow, and wrist bones here. And we're going to create the same layer swapping situation where only the lower arm and the hand and fingers are part of the layer swap, because we need the upper arm to stay behind the torso as it is here. But just to save some time, because this character is a little more complicated with the separate hand and then individual fingers, I'm just going to focus on the arm and just kind of show you the procedure for the arm. Everything else is really exactly the same, so we won't carry this all the way through to completion, but that would be a little repetitive at this point anyway. So what we need to do is unlock this arm layer, and we would do the hand and the pinky and the middle and the index. We'd unlock all those, and we'd duplicate all those layers. I'm just going to duplicate this arm layer here. And then we would move all those layers, and again, I'm just going to move the arm layer here. We're just going to speed things along and put that above the body and the legs, but behind the left arm, and then rename this. And then here's where it just gets a little bit different. Obviously, this is the entire arm, upper and lower, but we only want the lower arm to come in front of the body. So what we would do is simply select this top arm layer and pre-compose it. And in our pre-comp here, we want to make sure and check leave all attributes so that our puppet tools and our parenting and all that stuff stay in this composition. And then we'll click OK. And then we have just the arm in here. And then all we have to do is draw a mask that just masks out the upper arm. And we can do this with a little bit of a circle, so we get a little bit of a curvature there. I'm not going to take a ton of time here, but you get the idea. And then what we have here is just a lower arm. But when we go back to the Orange Woman rig comp here, that lower part of the arm still has the same puppet tool with the same puppet mesh going all the way up to the upper arm. Let's color it blue. So it'll still function with all of our other rigging, because it's got exactly the same puppet tool on it, the same puppet pins and everything else. But now it gives us the opportunity to bring that arm in front of the body. Now we don't have the hand and the fingers and all that done here, but you can see what we've got. But we've got the upper part of the arm still sitting behind. Now in the case of this right arm with the arm moving from back to front, all we would need to do to finish this layer swap rig would be to first duplicate and move the hand and finger bits up here with our new lower arm top level layer. And then we could just add our opacity animation and checkbox control just to this top level arm layer and to the top level and original hand and finger layers. Now we're not going to go through this whole process, but remember all the steps are on the PDF cheat sheet. The thing is, we can just leave the original arm layer untouched and let that layer be our upper arm when we've swapped the lower arm and hand in front. And when our checkbox is off and we're unswapped, that single arm layer will be both the upper and lower arm because they're both included in that one layer. So all we're really doing is turning on lower arm and hand pieces and turning them off to make this back to front layer swap work. And we don't gain anything. In fact, we probably lose a little bit of performance by duplicating that arm layer a third time for that extra lower arm down there at the bottom. It's just not necessary. Now, in the case of doing a layer swap with a puppet tooled arm and hands that go from front to back as we have with our left arm, we will need two separate lower arm layers for the layer swap, and we'll need one upper arm only layer with all three of those layers sharing the same puppet mesh and pins, just like we have with our two layers on the right hand. Because the upper arm needs to stay on top of the body while the lower arm switches back and forth. So we can't get away with just a two-layer setup here, just turning that lower arm on and off. We're going to need those three layers. a single upper arm layer, and 2 lower arm layers. So let's take a look at how we set up that slightly different situation. It's very similar, but just a little bit different. So in the case of the left hand, what we want to do is find that left arm layer here. And we just want to go ahead and pre-compose that right out of the gate. And again, make sure we're leaving all attributes in here. And I'm not going to open this time. Let's just go ahead and pre-compose that. Let's recolor that red. And let's rename this layer arm upper. And then we're going to duplicate this layer twice. We'll name the first one arm lower. And then we'll name the second one arm lower bottom. The arm lower bottom, of course, we're going to move down and place under the legs and the torso. Now remember, we'd also want to be doing this with the hand and the fingers. I'm just skipping that to save a little time now. And then we'll want to come up into the project window where we've pre-composed that arm, and we're going to duplicate this. And we'll call one of these arm lower comp. And we'll call this one arm upper comp. And then in each of these comps, we're going to mask off the appropriate part. So in arm upper here, we'll mask off the upper part of the arm. And I'm not going to do a real good job here just to get you guys the idea. So we'll have the upper arm there. And we'll want to make sure and create a decent overlap, although it doesn't have to be a perfectly circular overlap in this case. It just has to overlap. So a good way to do that is to copy the mask from the upper arm here and paste it onto the lower, and then simply turn it into a subtraction mask, and then just alter this so we're kind of overlapping at about the same area. And again, in this case, it's not necessary to create a perfectly circular overlap. It just has to overlap to some degree. Now we just need to swap in the lower arm to our lower arm layers here. So we can just select our 2 lower arm pieces. So our lower arm here and our lower arm down here. Hold down the Option key and swap in our lower arm composition. And there that pops back into place. And once again, we've got the puppet tools on all of those layers exactly the same pins, parented to the same bones and the same rigging. So all of the rigging works just like it should, but we now have essentially an upper arm layer and a lower arm layer. And we can go ahead just like we did with the previous lessons and set up our opacity keyframes and tie them to our checkbox. Again, I'm not going to repeat that since we went over that in detail. Now, a slightly easier version of this exact same situation is here in Hipsterman Rig 4. In this situation, we have an arm that is puppet tooled. But in this case, of course, it was created by pre-composing 2 layers together. So we're essentially already part of the way through our process. We've already got our left arm pre-composed, and we would just need to go through the same procedure we went through here of duplicating it twice. So we have an upper arm version and 2 lower arm versions. And then again, we would duplicate it once up here in the project window. And then all we would have to do is in one, turn off the upper arm, and the other one, turn off the lower arm. Once again, essentially just creating an upper and a lower arm that all have the same puppet tools, puppet pins connected to the same bones, and so on. So it's exactly the same situation, just a little bit easier because we don't need to mask anything out. So note that in every case here, we're really looking at the same basic situation. There might be some differences in the way we create the layers we need depending on how the rig was originally created, but the concept is exactly the same. Now, before we move on here, let's remember to keep cleaning up, and if you make any additional pre-comps, you always want to move those into the pre-comp folder. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you, again, we're not going to walk through the rigging of this, but I just want to show you how you can kind of push these ideas without adding anything different that we haven't already learned, but how you can push these ideas to create a more complicated setup. So let's go to Hipsterman Rig 5 here. Now in this case, we've already got our layer swapping already rigged up. So we have our hand that can be in front of our body, and with our checkbox, we can put that hand behind the body. But what's cool about this rig setup is that we can also add props. So I'm going to jump to my prop holding hand here, and you'll see we have a prop on and off checkbox, and I can turn on a prop, our skateboard here. So now he's holding the skateboard. But I can also still do my layer swapping. So now I can layer swap the arm behind, and the prop goes behind as well. Super cool. Now, again, there's nothing in this rig that we haven't already done, but I'll just do a quick walkthrough here so you can see how this is set up. So the way this works is, let's unshy our layers here. Just as you'd expect, we have our regular version of the arm sitting on top here, and it includes our prop pre-comp that also has our 3 different props: our skateboard, our guitar, our beer bottle. And then down below here, you can see we have the lower versions, the bottom versions for switching behind. We have the hand, the prop pre-comp, and the lower arm all down here. Now here's the trick. The opacity animation here on this prop pre-comp, this is tied to our arm front and back checkbox. So when we check this on and off, it's turning on and off the opacity of this prop pre-comp. But note that I can still turn the prop itself on and off. So I can have the arm behind and I can turn the prop on and off, and I can have the arm in front and turn the prop on and off. The secret is with just an additional pre-comp. So if I unlock this prop comp here and double click on it, you'll see that within this comp, I have another prop pre-comp. So I don't have my prop layers here. My prop layers are in this second composition. So there's my skateboard, my guitar, and my beer. They've got the opacity keyframes that are tied to the selection slider. In here, we have the opacity animation that simply turns this prop pre-comp on and off. So I can turn the props on and off in this pre-comp, and then I can turn the pre-comp on and off here in the main rig comp. That allows me to have it function with the arm forward and back and function with the prop on and off switch, which is what this opacity is tied to. So it's just simply inserting an additional pre-comp so I can have 2 separate opacity animations tied to 2 separate checkboxes. Now, the other thing that I was able to do by having this interim pre-composition, this extra pre-comp, is I was able to add another cool level of control, which is I now have offset control for the position and rotation of my prop. So my prop is always going to be parented to the hand and essentially being held by the hand. But I can also adjust how that prop sits within the hand by adjusting these position controls here. And I can even change the angle of the prop in the hand with this rotation here. Now, obviously, this isn't working exactly right with our hand here. I might have to have some additional hands or a different hand in order to manipulate these as much as I need to. But this really depends on your character design and whether you've got mechanical hands or a replacement hand rig. So there's different ways to set this up, but I just wanted to show you this possibility. So this allows the prop to be moved around within the hand, and it's achieved in the same way that we achieve this additional opacity control by having this interim pre-composition. So within this pre-composition, I zeroed out the position value of the prop comp itself, and that's tied to that point controller. And then this is parented to a null, and the rotation of the null is tied to our angle control. Now, why do I have the null in here? That's because as we're moving this position around, it would then change the anchor point where the prop would rotate from. If we move the position and then tried to rotate the prop comp, it would rotate not in his hand. But we've got this null that stays where his hand is. So even as we're rotating this, no matter where it is position-wise, it essentially stays sitting within his hand. So having a little null object there takes care of that little problem. So there's nothing here that we haven't already done. Everything that you see here, we've learned in different lessons in this course. It's just putting them together in different ways. And that's what I'm hoping you'll get out of this course. There's no possible way that I can show you every possibility and every option and every permutation of these different rigging techniques within one course. But I'm trying to show you how I'm giving you bits and pieces that you can combine in different ways to create all kinds of interesting rigs. In our next couple of lessons, we'll look at adding some more awesome bells and whistles to really push our rigs forward. I'll see you then.